Okay, welcoming back once again, Fern Halper onto the podcast today. She's been on many times before. I hope everyone out there listening has tuned into all of her episodes. But today she's going to shed some insights on generative AI, a topic that I'm sure everyone out there is very intrigued about, probably hearing about it every day. But for us, we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive on this episode into some of the terminology that you may have heard when learning or hearing about generative AI, and I know I have. So this will help me specifically clear up some questions that I have, regarding generative AI. But before we dive in, Fern, thanks again for showing up here today and talking with us. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. Doing well. I'm excited to learn something here.
Well, let's see.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to break down some of these terms. The first of which is foundation model. Again, a term that I'm sure some people have heard, others may not have heard. But Fern, I think I'll just hand it over to you to give us some insight on what a foundation model is, how is it used, and maybe you can tie it into specifics, around the generative AI aspects.
Yeah, sure. So a foundation model, I'll break this down, but a foundation model refers to models that are pre-trained on huge amounts of data, and then they're fine-tuned for specific tasks. So I think that the terminology, the foundation, the model acts as a foundation upon which other things can be built, right? And I think that, like, I never heard of the term foundation model, but then I looked it up in preparation for this, for this podcast. And to me, I had never heard of it before, but apparently the term has been around since 2018, 2019. So the associated with pre-training large models on extensive amounts of data and then fine-tuning them for specific tasks. So for tasks like NLP and computer vision, it was in the literature before that. And when we think of foundation models, we typically think of things like GPT-4. Most people probably heard of that as sort of feeding ChatGPT. It's the latest foundation model that feeds ChatGPT. And GPT-4 is a large language model, like you've heard the term LLM. So it's a large language model for text data. It's a foundation model that's for text data. And it's trained on billions and billions of parameters. And then it's able to predict which words statistically come next, when you put in a prompt. So that makes it seem like it's talking to you. And so when we talk about something like GPT-4, that model's been trained on a corpus, that's basically the internet, right? And then it's been used in tools like ChatGPT. You've heard of BERT, maybe BERT, that's another large language model. So in terms of how it's used, the foundation model, or let's talk about the large language model in this case, you may, you're training it on all of, in general, the generalized foundation model, you've trained on this huge corpus of information. So that data may have included things like poems by Keats, and others. So you could write a prompt, to write a poem in the style of Keats, or the LLM might have been trained as part of its training on numerous Python models. And so it could be prompted to write a Python model to accomplish a specific task, right? So that's how you can do this. And so what we're seeing is that organizations are using these standalone generalized LLMs to perform tasks like writing marketing content, or generating an email, or providing Q&A kinds of capabilities, when you just ask ChatGPT, tell me about large language models, and it comes back with a whole, give me 350 words on large language models, and then it'll tell you about that. And, so also I use the words pre-trained and fine-tuned. So I want to define what I mean by those two. Now, of course, those words have been around for a while, but in this context of generative AI, this pre-training is where the model is trained on this massive amount of data, like we were just talking about, to learn language structure and facts in the world, and some reasoning capabilities, so at that stage, the model is a generalist type of model and handling different types of tasks, but maybe it's not specialized for any particular task. So that's why you want to fine tune it. You may take a pre-trained model and then you may further train it or fine tune it on a narrower data set, providing you data for a specific task. And then that helps the model specialize, and perform data for a particular task, so I might, because I know your next question is going to be giving me an example of that. If I'm TDWI and, I want to build a chat bot using a generative AI model on my courses, maybe I'm going to train that general AI model on, what courses TDWI offers, or you're a company, you may want to train it on what products, your company offers, so it can answer certain questions, right? But it's all of this training like we've done for eons, not eons, but we've done for a while, with machine learning and other types of algorithms where you give it lots of, you give it examples. Typically they're labeled examples, which means that if you label an image, if we talk about images, like cat, dog, that sort of thing. So and you tell it what it is, and it goes through and it sort of learns from that. So that is a foundation model. Is that clear to you?
It is. I think that's really, it makes a lot of sense. And I actually like the name foundation. I think that helps establish what we're talking about, right? You start with this and then you can train it and build it out. One thing I do want to ask, though, is you used a term large language model. And I think that if maybe you can differentiate between foundation model and large language model. Is the foundation model a large language model? Is it part of that? Is it a subset of that? How can you maybe talk a little bit about the difference between a large language model and a foundation model?
Yeah. So in this case, the large language model was a type of foundation model. It just happened to be a large language model. There can be other foundation models, that are good for images or good for audio or for a specific task. It's just that they're so computationally expensive to train these things that most times organizations don't have them. They don't necessarily build them themselves, although some organizations have built foundation models, but the large language model is a type of foundation model that is around language.
Okay, so that's helpful. And then you kind of, led into a question that I was going to ask as well is how do you obtain one of these foundation models? Do you have to build them? Can you buy them? Where do you go if you're a company that's looking to use this?
Yeah, that's a really good question because a lot of companies now, they're playing with sort of the open versions of these generative AI tools. Like, they're getting a subscription to ChatGPT, for instance. But then they're realizing, hey, I have my own data. I don't want to give it to ChatGPT. So there are vendors out there that are providing foundation models that you can then put sort of behind your firewall. And some of them are just, GPT or BERT. I don't know if GPT is, if they're actually doing that, but, they'll take like BERT, for example, and then they'll do something with it and then offer it up, as something that you can use for
Interesting.
your own applications. And then they'll also build their own applications, on it. They'll fine tune the model to do like document classification or something like that, so you can also buy that service from them. So that's starting to happen now, where if you look at probably, I'll say, look at cloud providers, a lot of them are already, and cloud data platforms, they're already sort of offering up an ability to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? It feels like just like the next iteration of maybe servers going way back is like, you had all these different servers and service providers, and then you have cloud and cloud providers, and now it makes all the sense in the world if people are going to be training this and they want their own data to be staying in house and not out in the public. People will be offering foundation models that they could be using, right?
Yeah, and a way to use it so that, I suppose, so that it's not so it's not as computationally expensive as it might be. I will say though, I mean, Chat GPT, there's supposed to be a way that you can actually say, I don't want, like, this is my private data. Don't use it as part of your training corpus, right? Because as you're putting more information into Chat GPT and training it, you may be, using prompts and prompt engineering that now it has your company data in it, but supposedly there's a way to turn that off, but a lot of people don't necessarily trust that. So
I would be hesitant on that as well. I'd probably try one of these, subscription foundation models or something like that first in house. But you did very nicely, I think, get me to the next terminology that I was going to ask you about here. So you use prompt a couple times in your explanation for foundation models, and used it there again. It's probably a word that people are very familiar with. They've been probably even, submitting prompts through to ChatGPT and others. But can you talk a little bit about what a prompt is, maybe quickly, and then maybe a little bit deeper on like prompt engineering?
yeah, because that's really where the action is, I guess. So a prompt in generative AI is what it sounds like. It's an instruction or a cue. So it's the input that you give to the model to drive the output. Like I gave some examples, create a Python program for me that calculates the average of the numbers provided below. And then you would tell it something about the numbers provided below, or please write me 100-word abstract for a webinar about Chat GPT and generative AI, right? So the idea with the prompt is that you want to be clear, you want to be specific, give some examples, that sort of thing. But then there's this term prompt engineering, which has really like hit the stratosphere, I think. But it's a new term, and it refers to carefully crafting prompts to obtain the best outputs from generative AI models. So the idea is that you're designing and then you're refining these prompts. So it sounds like it's making something straightforward complex, like I got to be specific, I got to be clear, with my prompts. Let's call it prompt engineering, right? So it's I guess it's what it is. It can actually really help with the output. And when you think about prompt engineering, I've even seen where there are different kinds of prompt engineering techniques and they have names, right? So you might have heard someone say, I'm going to do a few shot prompting, like few shot, zero shot, or few shot. And like the first time I heard that, I said, what are they talking
Yeah.
about? And but basically you give up the model, you give the generative foundation model, you give it a few examples, like 3 to 5. So maybe it is maybe it's like some examples of sentiments in certain phrases, where you're giving it, I hate this company, blah, blah, blah. And then you say negative, and then you give it a number of different examples. And then, you're training it a few examples, basically, is what I think it means. So also, you want to be able to, maybe you want the output to look a certain way. So you feed the model structured input that looks a certain way. So, that's another type of thing to think about. I mean, there's other types of prompt engineering techniques also. So there's, for example, there's chain of thought prompting. So, that sounds like what it is too. What's my chain of thought? So if you break these down, it's not really that complicated, but it's basically you're saying, oh, what's my chain of thought? And typically the example that's given is some sort of mathematical problem, and then how you would actually break down that problem in your chain of thought. So what are the reasoning steps? What are the intermediate reasoning steps involved in that? So that's like chain of thought. And then, building on that, I've seen a prompt engineering technique called tree of thought, that builds trees out of the chain of thoughts. So I've seen papers where they're talking about 20 different types of techniques for prompt engineering. So I've just named a few here, zero shot, few shot, chain of thought, tree of thought. But there's a lot of other prompt engineering techniques. But if you just sort of think about it as creating prompts to obtain the best output, based on what you want the generative AI model to do, then it sort of takes the mystique away from the term prompt engineering. And people talk about now that prompt engineering is some new type of job. I think that maybe like in the context of building applications, when you have developers, data engineers, and now you'll have prompt engineers. But I think that, we're talking about that when you get into much more complex types of generative AI applications, where you're actually, building some applications that are taking your own data and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But, people can learn, like we're doing a conference in February on AI, and we're going to have a workshop on prompt engineering. And so that will be, for business people to learn different types of prompt engineering techniques. So we're not talking about hugely complex things there. So I think I answered prompt engineering.
Yeah, you nailed that one. 100%. I think it's interesting too, because I feel like anyone that's capable of asking a question could potentially say, I am a prompt engineer, right? Like if I just ask a string of questions and I try to fine tune what I'm getting at, almost just by iteration, just continuing to try, which is honestly how most people have started interacting with generative AI, was just going on to Chat GPT and asking 12 questions that came to their head and then following up on those answers based on the results, right? If they ask one question and they're like, oh, that's an interesting answer, I didn't know that, or maybe that's wrong, and then they maybe reworded that same question, asked it again, and maybe got a different response or a different output. But look, I think you really hit on something there when it comes to like maybe those really intensive beginning stages of like bringing in a foundation model like we just talked about for a company, and then like starting to build off of that. That's where I think prompt engineering, quote unquote prompt engineering, would be quite valuable. And not everyone can do that, right? Like that's not something where we could just sit here and type fun questions into our keyboards and say that we're engineering something.
Right. So when the engineer is sort of developing, they're taking maybe your company's data, and telling the foundation model how to think about that, not think, but you know what I mean? Like how to
Yes.
use that information. Sorry, I
Yeah.
don't use the word think yet with this. Yeah, but that's why they're calling it engineering, because they're thinking of something more complex. Because I agree with you that, I can go and type in anything I want and get really good with refining my prompts and, train some sort of model, but I don't necessarily consider myself an engineer. So
Right.
maybe I'm doing
Well,
some simple engineering tasks, but
yeah.
I'm like the actual, developer who's going to develop these applications, even though the term sounds very sophisticated. So
Yeah, no offense to all the professional prompt engineers that are out there in the world that are doing the hard work, but the way I feel like right now, Fern, you and I could both put prompt engineer on our LinkedIn resume, no problem. We can do that right now, and I don't think too many people would be calling us liars.
I think we're going to get hopefully we get some people responding saying, this is what I do for I do this
Yeah,
for prompt engineering, and you couldn't do that.
I'm
That's what I want to hear,
I'm sure
actually.
I'm sure there's several things out there that I would have no clue on how to do when it comes to prompt engineering. So
Yeah, and again, it's like, this is more complex. So
yeah,
that
absolutely.
yeah, so it just gets more and more complex. But it's sort of like democratizing analytics. You think about the business user
Hmm.
using the tool to democratize, to get answers that they need for the questions that they want, and they're doing it simply, by using some tools that are simple to use. They're not saying that, they're a data scientist who's
Right.
building an algorithm. Maybe the same analogy holds here.
Yeah, and I would say too that training those business folks or anybody that might be interacting with this generative AI application that you may be using, it makes sense for them to take training for prompts, take prompt engineering classes to, get to that, be able to track your train of thought and get to the insights that you're looking for, hopefully quicker, right? Like that's the end goal
Yeah,
there.
there's probably like different prompts that are good for certain
Exactly.
things. So
You can learn that a little bit, almost like, learning a different language a little bit. So you talked about foundation models, which is really the base. We've moved on to how you interact now through prompts and prompt engineering. Let's talk a little bit about the output here. And a term that many people may be familiar with, or maybe not, is a hallucination. And I think this one may be relatively straightforward as far as a term goes, but can you let us know a little bit about what hallucinations are in regards to generative AI outputs?
yeah, sure. So a hallucination is actually where the model provides output that's factually incorrect, but it sounds authoritative when it's doing so. And that's because of its limitation in its training data. So it's basically the wrong answer. One example of this is Google when they first unveiled a demo of Bard, which was its competitor to ChatGPT. The tool came up with the wrong answer to response in response to a question about the James Webb Space Telescope and discoveries that were made by it. So, there's other examples also where lawyers, have been cited for, using, I guess, ChatGPT to do some prep and things
Oh,
came, wrong. And, so hallucinations can be dangerous, right?
right.
Because it sounds like it's right, but if you don't know that it's not right, then there's a problem. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that, and recently there was some conversations online about certain foundation models being trained, once people started putting in all of it, as it was learning more and more, it was producing wrong answers more of the time because
Uh-oh.
it was, because the training data that it was being trained on wasn't good enough, wasn't actually reality. So
Mm.
yeah, that's sort of the simple thing about hallucinations. They sound simple, but I guess they can get you into a lot of trouble. That's why, it's important for people to still understand what they're talking about. You just can't take the output, just like you couldn't take the output of a machine learning model and think that it was going to be, you know, good, until you actually, did your due diligence. Likewise, you can't just take the output of ChatGPT or any other of these tools and think that they're going to be factually correct.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you got an output, just a random follow-up here, if you got an output that you were unsure of, what would be the steps for you to verify that? Would you just go to Google and start doing some research that way to try and figure out like the right answer? What would be the recourse? Or would you try to retool your prompt and do some prompt engineering and ask a different question, see if you can get kind of the same answer?
Yeah, I mean, I use these tools to do things like if I have a writer's block or something like that,
Sure.
like I'm writing something and I have a writer's block, and I'll want to ask it a question about, define this terminology and tell me blah blah blah. I'll ask
Mhm.
it to cite its sources, right?
Oh,
I'll do
perfect.
that in the first place. But then based on my knowledge, which is why, human computer interaction is important,
Yeah.
based on my knowledge, I'll say this doesn't sound right.
Hmm.
And then I'll do some more qualitative research about it, and yeah, using Google and other tools
Sure.
to try to see if it even makes sense. And then if it doesn't make sense, I'll say, and it tries to do it itself, where I'll say this was incorrect,
Oh,
what you really meant was blah blah blah, just to, try to be a good citizen of whatever, but
yeah.
or in some way tell it that it wasn't, this was incorrect. So, but it's a good question if you, yeah, anyway. So, yeah,
Yeah,
but that's why I don't trust anything unless I verify it from a couple of different sources. That's just, I guess,
absolutely.
the analyst in me,
Yeah.
that will want to make sure that this makes sense. So,
Yeah, I think this is going to be maybe the hardest part about generative AI in our society and using it all the time is making sure that when you're trying to maybe cut a corner, especially, for all the kids out there that are going to school and maybe using this to try and write some papers, you can't just take it on face value, and you have to assume that you're not the only one in your class potentially asking this thing the same question. So you may all end up with the same wrong information and turning that in, and getting yourself in trouble there, just as an example. So and then obviously with all the fake news out there, that's been a whole, I don't know, it feels like a whole decade or two of people talking about the term fake news. There's only so much that you can do to prevent that from leaking into these models as well. So we've had I think Jim Kabilas and I have done one or two on generative AI, and we talked a little bit about how to try to reduce these hallucinations, or at least, make sure you're putting in specifically the right information into the foundation model if you're building something out. And it's just a difficult task. But Fern, one last term for you to define for us before I let you go here. It's a term called embeddings. And this one I'm actually not
yeah.
super familiar with myself. So can you take us through what embeddings are, please?
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot more about embeddings, and I think we'll start off with the notion of a vector database.
I did
So
a podcast on vector databases, so I know what those are. Here we go.
okay, yeah, so it's a database that stores data in vector format, right? Where each data point is represented as a vector or a numerical array, like developers are used to hearing about those. So they're being used to store text and image, other types of data in, as a vector, as basically as a vector of numerical values. So embedding is a technique that allows you to take any data type and represent it as a vector. So this helps, and so that actually helps in situations where you're trying to find similar relationships between vectors, right? And that's how ChatGPT would work, finding relationships between words and predicting the probability of the word that comes next. That's why if we say that an embedding is a technique that allows you to take any data type and represent it as a vector, then you can look at, the similarity between the data points in the vectors. And, if you take embedding models that can transform raw data into vector embeddings, then the embeddings that the embedding vectors, whatever, that are close together are similar, and those that are far apart are different, and that's how you sort of get to this ability to sort of have a tool like ChatGPT, actually predict the probability of the word that comes next because it's close to it, and the vectors are close to, if you visualize it,
Right.
they're close to each other, and so it knows which word comes next, and that's why it seems like it's speaking in English, but it's really, just looking at the probability of, what word comes next,
Interesting.
assuming the data was stored in some sort of vector database, which these vector databases now, are becoming part of sometimes becoming part of companies' sort of overall infrastructure and architecture when they start to build these generative AI models, because they need to transform the raw data into vectors to do whatever they're going to be doing with it. And some of that's going above my pay grade, in terms of developing these actual models. But that's my understanding of what embeddings are.
Mm,
They're a way to represent it's data represented as vectors, or called
right.
vector embeddings. So
Maybe a super simplified way, at least the way that I've been thinking about it, is kind of like, putting all your data and giving it a coordination on a map in an instance. I understand vectors also have like directions and all that stuff, so it's a little bit more complex than
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But like visually, the way that I look at it is you take all these data points and then you give them a like longitude, latitude essentially, and you put them on a map. You know, you have this giant map of all these data points, and then whatever is really close to it seems like they're all quite familiar. Like if you're in an ocean, the point just to the right of you, probably also in that ocean, for an instance. I don't know. That's the way that I've been conceptualizing it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because I've seen, visualizations of these things,
Mm-hmm.
where they're actually plotting them in three-dimensional space, like in the case of when you can do it that way. Yeah, and it does look like that, where these things are sort of close together and other things are far apart. And I've seen it done that way. I've seen it done like as little circles,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and bigger circles, and um, and the stuff that's in the middle of the circle is really close together, and the stuff that's on the outside. Anyway, yeah. So there's different ways of,
Interesting.
yeah, showing similarity, I suppose. But that's, I think, where this term came from. At least that's my understanding.
Well, this was a great learning experience for me. I'm hopeful that our audience members learned something as well. Um, it's always a pleasure talking with you, Fern. Really appreciate you coming on here. I know we're going to have a lot more generative AI content. As you mentioned, we're going to be having a TDWI Las Vegas in February, just right around the corner. Hard to believe that we're almost into 2024 at this point, but it is coming up very quickly. For more information, you can visit tdwi.org and click on our events tab there. You'll see what we have going on. Uh, Fern, thanks again. Always a pleasure. I'll let you go at this point. Have a good rest of your day, okay?
You too. Thank you.